very welcome to this public lecture this evening. So it is a great pleasure to be able to introduce two fantastic speakers that will enrich our thinking about international politics tonight. The first speaker is Andreas Bummel, who is Executive Director of the NGO Democracy Without Borders, but is also the Global Coordinator of the campaign for United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, which he helped establish more than 10 years ago. And he's also a fellow of the World Academy of Art and Sciences. So apart from being an important campaigner on changes in the international system, he's also an author of various important publications on this topic, and probably his work, his writing on these topics culminated so far in this book, A World Parliament, which you can actually see on my back, the cover, subtitled Governance and Democracy in the 21st Century, which he co-authored with Leinen, who is a member of the European Parliament. So let me say that I highly recommend this work as a work of impressive erudition, linking together history, an overview of contemporary challenges on a number of domains, but also with bold institutional imagination. And the way that Andreas combines both promoting the idea and campaigning for the idea and his activity, his political activity, together with a deep analysis, intellectual analysis of the problems that this proposal, in a sense, tries to address, reminds me of actually the founding period of another important moment of constitutional development, which is the founding of the United States. During the United States founding, you had people that were creating the new constitution. They were negotiating an important political development, but at the same time, they were thinking very deeply about it. Okay, so people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton not only were members of the convention that generated the American Constitution, but also produced work of very high intellectual quality and insight and erudition. So nowadays, these founders were successful. They are commemorated in in stamps and public squares, and you probably know that there is even a musical on Alexander Hamilton, which is running with a lot of success here in London and New York. So I wonder, after the UN gets its Parliamentary Assembly, if there might be also commemorations of Andreas and maybe even a musical done about Andreas and the UNPA campaign. So the second speaker that we are lucky to have tonight is Dr. Theresa Squatrito, who is a member of the faculty of the International Relations Department. She's a world authority on international institutions, and in particular on institutional change that makes those institutions more accessible, more transparent, and perhaps some people would say more democratic. So who else would be better placed to assess essentially this big project, this grand project of institutional change? So I think that we will learn a lot from both Andrea and Theresa tonight. So a few ground rules. So Andrea will speak for about 45 minutes, and Theresa will follow up with some comments, maybe for about 10 minutes, and then maybe Andreas might want to briefly give a response, and then the floor is open. Then it's your turn to voice comments, to ask questions, and to raise objections if you like. Okay? So Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mathias, for the invitation to speak here, and the London School of Economics Department of International Relations. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here about the project of World Parliament, and more specifically a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. And I think we are all happy that you are here, despite the health risks that you have taken, these days. We will talk more about that, I'm sure, later. Maybe a little bit about myself and my background. I'm born in South Africa, and as a child I came with my family back to Germany. That was in the 80s, and I took a big interest, even as a growing up youth, in the situation in South Africa, namely the crime of apartheid, of course. And I also took a big interest in the crime that was committed by Germany, the Holocaust, during the Second World War, with more than 6 million people sent to their deaths. And I think these two things somehow culminated in me in a feeling that we need to do something in very general terms, you know, as a youth. We need to do something about this, so that such crimes are stopped, prevented, and cannot happen again. And that is the promise, of course, of the United Nations. Never again. Never again a Holocaust and such crimes against humanity. And that has had a very strong impact on me. And also a third factor that came in was that we moved to Western Germany, and the possibility of immediate nuclear annihilation was, you know, reality. We were, you know, in the Frankfurt area, where there was an important US Army air base, the airport, the stock exchange, and so on. So Frankfurt and the whole area would have been one of the first targets that would have been blasted, you know, by nuclear weapons, just a few hundred kilometers across the border in the east. So, you know, in the 80s, that terrorized me, that feeling that everything we cherish, I cherish, can be gone just, you know, like this. And what gave me so much hope, and to this day actually, was that apartheid was abolished. There was peaceful, relatively peaceful change in South Africa. Mandela came free. The Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. And there was a so-called third wave of democratization across Eastern Europe, in Latin America, and elsewhere. And that gave me so much hope. At the time, I was 20 or so years old, and I realized this is, you know, a wave that we can use to change the system, how the world operates, the world governance is operating. And unfortunately, I mean, I was not alone with this, of course. There was the Commission on Global Governance in 1995. There was Perestroika with Gorbachev and all these things going on. You know, it was mainstream thought that things need to be changed, that there needs to be a new world order. But this term already, you know, indicates that there was something else coming forward. Unfettered neoliberalism, continued US imperialism, you know, and no change in the structure of the UN. Quite the contrary, we witnessed the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, where, you know, 800,000 Tutsi were murdered with machetes in just a few months, and the UN stood by, could do nothing. And the Bosnian genocide, of course, a year later, where, you know, UN peacekeeping forces were witnessing like that the Bosnian foreign minister was taken out of the car and shot in front of them. And that, you know, that shook me very much. I was thinking the UN is here to stop these things and to provide a working system of collective security. And this is my background, where I started really to also at an intellectual level to ponder what must be done. And I came, for me, to the conclusion, as many others, of course, that the nation state as a political system cannot be the last word in the political and social evolution of humanity, and it certainly will not be the last word. So we are, in my perception, we are in a transitionary period where we are seeing the first signs of the development of a world state that in one way or another will be the next level in political, social development of humanity. But this world state is not yet exactly visible. It is a failed state. Cao Jiang, which is a Chinese philosopher, he's speaking of the world as a failed state. He's coming from a very different perspective. In our Western modern political thought, the starting point is the nation state that has developed, and there are other perspectives and other cultural settings that look at the world as a whole without starting with its division into separate nation states. The book which you have mentioned in such flattering terms, thank you. It analyzes the history, the contemporary relevance, and the implementation of the idea of the World Parliament. And what I will be doing is first very briefly provide a general context, which I will assume is not going to be much of a surprise to you, but I think we need that to have this context. And then I will talk about root causes and implementation, which is then basically the project of a UN Parliamentary Assembly that I'm working on a day-to-day basis, if you wish. So the context that we are in is, I would say, a perpetual crisis of modernity. Modernity in the sense of modernity that is connected to the nation state, because we are in a world crisis and we perceive it as such. We might perceive it as it being very extraordinary, what we are going through right now with coronavirus and whatever. However, I would start with the perception that there is a continuous, never-ending crisis. If we go 10 years back or 20 years back, or there is always a crisis that we need to deal with, and I think there are root causes that are always the same. But first of all, let's just very quickly think about the crisis we are in. First of all, of course, we are in the middle of a climate crisis, which is not new at all. Also, the carbon emissions today are 1.4 times higher than they were in 1994 when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was decided. And at that time already, the international community said that it is in its joint interest to curb carbon emissions, which didn't happen. Actually, they're at the highest level ever. I think 2 years ago that was the case. 1 month ago, the observatory in Hawaii measured for the first time a level of 416 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is the highest ever. And it is being said, I'm not a climate scientist, right? But it's being said this is the highest level that has existed in 3 million years. And at that time, temperatures were 2 to 3 degrees higher and sea levels 15 to 25 meters higher. And this is, of course, not, a talk about climate change. It is just to remind ourselves where we are right now. And it is quite clear the UN itself does not believe that it will be possible in the context of the Paris Climate Agreement to reach the goal of 1.5 degrees, not more warming than 1.5 degrees. So that's the climate crisis that is overarching, and actually it is threatening the conditions on Earth that allow a sophisticated civilization to actually exist like we have it. And the stability of the Earth system as a whole is at risk. So we might reach irreversible tipping points, planetary boundaries. But this is all known to you. But I still think we need to realize this. There is an unprecedented refugee crisis. More than 70 million people are right now fleeing from war, persecution, and conflict. That's more than ever in the past 70 years. And there are many million stateless people who have no rights because they have no documentation, no ID, no birth certificate. They are citizens of nowhere, right? Who have no rights because they are not attached to some nation state. So if you are not attached to a nation state, you are stateless and you are left alone, basically, because in our system today, it is the nation states that are supposed to protect and advance human rights. And the UN is just a forum to help nation states do that, basically, in my perception. Then we have a geopolitical crisis on many fronts. I just want to mention one thing that for me is really dramatic, namely the fact that the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty has run out of force in August 2019, which means that intermediate range nuclear missiles can be, legally positioned, deployed in Europe and elsewhere, which means that the risk of nuclear conflict is, in my perception, much higher than it was before. And let's not speak about the symbolic impact that this has, the fact that this treaty is no longer in force. As is the case in terms of curbing climate emissions, international law has also failed to move forward with nuclear disarmament. The Non-Proliferation Treaty that was coming into force in 1970 actually obliges, and there is even a court case that was decided by the International Court of Justice. They are obliged to negotiate total disarmament in good faith, and they are not doing it. So this treaty is not worth the paper it's written on, because over 40 years the official nuclear powers have not fulfilled their obligation out of the treaty. And this is one instance, just like climate change, where we can see that intergovernmental negotiations and treaties, they don't actually deliver what they are supposed to deliver, in my perception. More than 3,600 nuclear warheads are still deployed and ready, half of it high readiness alerts, so they can be launched within 7 minutes, actually. And those warheads are sufficient to destroy life on Earth as we know it. And I mean, this is, as we sit here, still a realistic scenario, because they can also be launched not just because of a conscious decision, but also because of manipulation, accidents, and so on. We are in the middle of an unprecedented crisis of freedom and democracy. If we look at the last 30 years, of course, the number of democracies today is higher than it was ever. Like if we go 100 years back, there was almost no democracy at all. If we, consider women's rights and suffrage, that was only slowly then introduced. So we are at a very high level. But researchers have identified a process of autocratization that is taking place for more than 20 years already, hidden behind the development of formal democratic institutions at the nation-state level, which means that the level of freedom, liberty rights, those are slowly being diminished, even in established democracies. Let's not talk about autocratic states. Freedom House, that foundation in Washington, D.C., just last week ago, published its 2020 report and concluded that for the 14th consecutive time, overall level of freedom in the world declined. So this is not good news. And there are still 49 countries, or 25% in the world, that are not free, rated not free. And I think in the perception that that was developed in the 90s, the perception or the expectation at the time was that the wave of democratization would simply continue, but it was stopped at the latest, I think, after 9/11 and the so-called war against terrorism or on terrorism. Since then the level is stagnating, and it now seems to be going downwards. There is a crisis of trust behind this in democracies. Guterres, the UN Secretary General, called it a trust deficit disorder that affects declining trust not only among states, but in a rules-based global order, in national and international institutions, and the political establishment generally everywhere. And there's a lot of empirical research that is measuring levels of trust in the world, across countries, and so on. Huge majorities, that's one piece of good news, still believes in all world regions that democracy is, as a principle, is the most favored government type. But huge majorities at the same time are dissatisfied with how democracy is operating in practice. And there was just a study coming out also just 3 weeks ago or something, of the new Center for the Future of Democracy at the University of Cambridge, a study of 154 countries, and saying that 3 in 5 respondents would say they would express a negative view. There's an inequality crisis. Oxfam last year reported that the world's 26th richest individual, billionaires, own as many assets as the poorest 3.8 billion people on the world. This is for sure, for me, a sign for the dysfunctional tax system that we have, whereas the separation in 193, separate sovereign entities is the best possible world to create offshore possibilities to hide money, to avoid taxes and so on. It's undermining actually the functioning of our institutions, and it is building pressure, and in my view it also contributes to the rise of nationalist populism. There's a crisis of multilateralism for 2 years. That's the thing that's being talked about in New York at the UN. At the Security Council, observers say there is the worst climate that has existed in 40 years, even during the Cold War. Divisions are stark, the language is very bad, and well, the crisis of multilateralism has also, a sign in that the appellate body of the World Trade Organization is no longer working because no new judges can be appointed because of the veto of the United States, and so on. And there are so many, risks and threats that can turn into a new crisis at any time. I think one of the best examples we are just going through, that's this coronavirus, that was kind of in this form unexpected, but it's that the fact that a new pandemic can come up that is highly lethal, much more lethal than the coronavirus, is something that experts have been discussing for a long time, right? So this not only concerns a mutation that's, comes into, human transmission from animals, but it could also be lethal pathogens that are man-made, in biotech laboratories, or even nano, particles that are man-made and artificially created. This is a real threat that experts have identified long ago, and I don't think we have the systems and, arrangements in place to deal with such a thing. And I think the coronavirus crisis is one instance where we can actually see this. So all of this, in my point of view, are symptoms of an underlying deeper crisis. We are coming to the core here slowly. It's a crisis of the international system, or in more general terms, a crisis of global governance. And that's what I mentioned before. It's a crisis of modernity that has not, in my point of view, fully developed. The promise of modernity, of progress, has stopped halfway because the political institutions weren't fully developed at the global scale. That's one thesis I would like to put forward, and that means that modernity has stuck at the nation state level, and this is exactly what we need to deal with. It's also an intellectual crisis from my perspective, and a psychological crisis, in a sense that the reason why we are stuck at this nation-state level thinking has also to do with the identity of people. How do they identify themselves with the planet, with each other, with humanity? What is their outlook on the world? Do they consider themselves world citizens, who have a responsibility, or how do they identify? And so I think there are many, many levels involved in this crisis of global governance that actually we are dealing with in the UNPA campaign as well, but I will talk about more about that later. Basically, the problem is one of scale mismatch. The scale of the environmental, economic, financial, or technological systems that need to be managed today is increasingly planetary, but the political instruments that we have available to do this are at the scale of nation states. And at the fundamental level, the international system is anarchic, and it is driven by competition between these nation states. There is no single institution in the world that in a legitimate and real way is able to represent the best common interest of humanity as a whole. The UN is an instrument, a mechanism of its member states, and it is fully dependent on member states, even in very practical terms. It is dependent on the financial contributions of UN member states. And if those don't come forward, which was the case last year, there was a cash flow problem because the United States didn't pay its contributions on time. They cannot pay their staff. They cannot have meetings. The human rights regime, the human rights procedures were very strongly affected because they simply couldn't have their meetings because contributions weren't paid. So it is anarchic, And politically, I said that several times, and it's so important to stress the world is simply divided in 193 nominally sovereign nation states who do not accept any higher authority. Of course, there is the UN Security Council, which as one of the few bodies on this planet has the authority to adopt universally binding resolutions. But we need to ask ourselves who do these resolutions affect and how can they be enforced, right? And how does that, what is the meaning of the veto power of the 5 permanent members who can stop and do stop resolutions and deliberations on matters that affect themselves. So at least those 5, if you look at the system of the UN, they are above the law. They are above the enforcement mechanisms that are supposed to exist. Of course, there are reasons why the veto power was introduced, but in today's world, and there's a big consensus even amongst member states, the veto right makes less and less sense. So the principle of sovereignty means that nominally countries are considered equal. However, they are not equal at all. If you look, at the composition of a General Assembly of the UN, you will find this democratic deficit because small countries like Nauru or Tuvalu, they represent 10,000 citizens, and China represents 1.3 billion citizens, but they have the same, nominally, legally, they have the same voting power, namely one vote in the General Assembly, 1 seat in the General Assembly. And this is one of the core dysfunctions in the international system, which is not to say that small countries should not be represented, but certainly it is no accident that there is a proliferation of club governance like the G20, G7, and so on, because in those fora, governments can deliberate the larger ones can deliberate much easier than in the General Assembly, for instance. So in the General Assembly, it is possible in mathematical terms that there are 2/3 majority decisions that only represent, if you go, to the countries, that only represent 8.4% of the world's population. That is hardly democratic, I would say, from a cosmopolitan point of view, when we put citizens into the center of the attention and not states. And if we, compare this principle of, or the system of intergovernmental international law to a prospective system of cosmopolitan world law, there the individual has to have center stage and the common interest of humanity, whereas in the international law system, it is always about the interests of nation states, or let's put it in a different way, the interest of what governments say is in their nation's interest. There's a difference here. So the international order lacks the features of what is considered a sound legal system in a domestic setting. This amazes me very much, because in a domestic setting, we would take it for granted that there is a generally binding system of lawmaking through a legislative branch that has some democratic legitimacy. We would take it for granted that there's obligatory settlement of disputes in courts, and the courts would interpret the law. And we take it for granted that there are means of enforcement by an executive branch. And all these 3 elements, they don't exist in the international order. There is no generally, binding law, because rules are being made through intergovernmental negotiations, and treaties and countries, they can voluntarily join or not join a treaty, and if they join, they can, they can leave it again later if it no longer serves their interest. So this is the core problem that we are dealing with. And in my view, given the world's increasing interdependence, there's an inescapable logic that the nation state is not the last word, right? We need to move forward. We need to find the arrangements and procedures and institutions that allow for effective global government, right? The title here says governance, it's not on display, but what we are really talking about, I would argue, is government, right? So there is no mistake. We need to argue about the term of governance more, I think. The origins of the idea of a world parliament is before the system of nation states actually developed. that was during the French Revolution, when a Prussian-Dutch revolutionary named Andreas Boomer in 1794 and a few years before that argued that the French Revolution, with its slogan liberty, equality and fraternity, should move forward across the whole globe, and all territories that get rid of their feudal and monarchic rulers, they should join the democratic world republic that starts in France but is not French. The French nation state at the time didn't even exist. The French identity only had to develop. There was no common French language at the time. So his idea was that all those territories that were getting rid of those rulers, they would add themselves as départements to the world republic. And he was beheaded on 24 March 1794 as a traitor against the French interest. And that was, I think, a crucial moment, actually in world history, if you like, because at that moment, the whole impetus of the French Revolution took a different turn. It turned against a cosmopolitan understanding of liberty, fraternity, and equality, and it developed the idea of the modern nation state that is an island that is in competition to all others, right? So it took over the tradition of the sovereignty of feudal lords and transformed it into the modern nation state, which was the sovereignty of the people inside and the sovereignty of the state to the outside. And it could have taken a different turn, perhaps, right? Maybe Andreas Boomer's ideas could have materialized, right? I come from Germany, from the area of Mainz, and in fact, in 1793 or something, there was a few months when the territory there joined with, the French Republic, following the logic of Andreas Boomer, but that was wiped out by Prussian forces very quickly. Just a side note here. So that is, I think, the basic idea of the World Parliament, that equality, fraternity, and liberty are values that need to be implemented for all human beings on the planet, irrespective of where they are born, right? That they are, in fact, accepted as equal, something that is supposed to be already included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? The equal dignity of all human beings. But in reality, this is just, it's an illusion, because, as I indicated before, all rights we have are actually rights that we have because we are citizens of a certain country, right? And not because we are world citizens. And that's the point, that the World Parliament would be, a democratically elected body that is, giving a voice to all people, and that is the body, the instrument, that is in a legitimate way able to express the common interest of all and the species and the interest of our common habitat, the Earth. There's a whole chapter, a whole section in the book on the history of the World Parliament. So it started at the time of the French Revolution. The first who advocated it was beheaded and died. And then there's an academic debate. Even in the mid-19th century, there was already the debate about how to deal with autocratic countries in the World Parliament. Something that even today, we will certainly discuss it later. Even 150 years later, it's still relevant. And that's somehow shocking, because in 150 years, the system of nation states in its essential core hasn't changed. Let's make no mistake. There is a whole body of international law and all, but all countries except Costa Rica have still their own armies. They are arming themselves for the eventual possibility that they would have to wage war against each other. And even in the European Union, I think it is absolutely noteworthy that there is not yet a common EU army. Only at that point, in my opinion, once countries abolish their national armies and find other ways of collective security, then perhaps we can argue that we are heading towards a new level of collaboration. As long as we are pointing nuclear weapons and so on at each other, we are really at an anarchic state, and no trade treaties or whatever can change that. So The World Parliament that I described is, of course, a vision that is based on the idea of one person, one vote, irrespective of where you are born and who you are, what you're doing. You are a world citizen who participates and has responsibility in the common global affairs. The question, of course, given the crisis that I talked about, how do we get there, right? How do we get there? How do we make that leap forward? And there are so many levels I mentioned, psychologically, emotionally, intellectually, in theory, and so on. However, I think that there is an interconnection between the development of the human identity and consciousness and the development of social political institutions. This is a thesis, of course, that we can discuss. Like in Europe, I think in the EU, the introduction of a common currency and common institutions helped, at least in the younger generations, to also develop a European identity. And the Eurobarometer studies, they show each year again and again and again that at least in younger generations, there is a European identity, which is not exclusive. Georg Simmel, already before the First World War, he's a sociologist, he quite rightfully pointed out that human identity is layers, right? So if you identify as a European citizen, at the same time you can identify as a citizen of your nation state, a citizen of your province, whatever, and of course, as a world citizen too. It's not mutually exclusive. So how do we get to this idea of a world parliament? And I need to add, of course, the world parliament is not an isolated institutional proposal, but it would be embedded into a system of a world constitution. So there would have to be, in my perspective, in such a world constitution, important principles included, like federalism, and federalism in this sense of subsidiarity, meaning that problems need to be dealt with at the lowest possible level, but at a level that is still delivering solutions. Which means normally people, if they talk about subsidiarity, the only thing they think of is decentralization. Below the nation state, provinces, whatever, local authorities. However, they don't come across the idea that subsidiarity in this sense also means centralization to upper levels, right? So, for instance, the introduction of effective carbon emission taxes is probably something that would have to be dealt with at the global level by a global institution. This is arguable, of course, but it's just an example. Or the abolition of nuclear weapons and an effective system of collective security, arguable something that we would have to introduce at the global level. 5 minutes, is that right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So there are more such principles that would have to be included in a world constitution, because, for instance, we have moved beyond a Rousseau idea of democracy. It's not the dictatorship of a majority, so the protection of minority rights is something that would have to be included in such a world constitution. The separation of powers, with different branches of government, rule of law, and so on and so forth. However, in my opinion, the institution of the World Parliament is the core. Without this democratic body that represents all world citizens and gives them a voice, all of this, it doesn't function. It's the core of it. That's what grants the legitimacy of any of this and any global enforcement, which, by the way, in a system of world law, wouldn't be collective security in the sense that there would be measures against nation states, but ideally it would be judicial and police enforcement against individuals, not collectives. So the idea how we can get there is that we would start a process that step by step would introduce change and transformation into the existing system of the United Nations. The United Nations, I said it's an instrument of member states, which is true, but even Dag Hammarskjöld, one of the former Secretary Generals in the 1960s, pointed out that the United Nations is an embryo of a world state. And in my perspective, that is true. This United Nations, as flawed as it is, it represents the best possible, at this time, manifestation of the idea of cosmopolitanism in an institutional sense. So I think we need to introduce change into the UN, which is not yet happening. Security Council reform has been debated, I think it's 1974 or something. There is a committee dealing with it, with no results so far. So how do we introduce change? And we have an important inspiration in the European integration process, namely the European Parliament, that was established as a common assembly of the free European communities. And it was more or less consultative at the beginning, and step by step over decades, it developed into what we know today. The directly elected political powerhouse in the legislative system of the European Union at the transnational level. And the European Parliament also played an important role in pushing the European integration project forward at difficult times. For instance, at the beginning of the 80s, when there was still the principle of, consensus rule, nothing went forward, and the European Parliament, what did it? It presented a draft constitution for a European Union based on qualified majority voting, and that pushed governments into the need to respond and develop procedures that provide a way forward. So the UN Parliamentary Assembly project is based on that inspiration. At this time, all bodies at the UN, they are composed of representatives of the executive branch of UN member states. We want that parliamentarians, directly elected parliamentarians at the nation state level, are represented there as well. And this involves one important element, that opposition and minority parliamentarians have the ability to have voice and seat at the UN too, because the government parties will be there, but the opposition needs to be there as well. And one important other element that we think must be introduced in such a body is that it would operate based on transnational political groups. So there would not be geopolitical groups or a German delegation, a UK delegation, or a US delegation, but individual delegates from different parties would come into this body, and they would be obliged to form transnational groups based on a common ideological or political outlook, like we do have it in the European Parliament. There is a Green group, a Conservative group, a Socialist group, and so on. And these groups, they wouldn't look at solutions and proposals from the perspective of specific nation-state interests, but they would look at global approaches from the starting point of their ideological outlook, right? So a peasant in India who is represented by some elected representative, who's electing that representative, he might have more in common than somebody from a remote area in Africa than from the capitals. What I'm saying is that there wouldn't be an Indian group in the parliament, but there might be a group that is attached to peasants' interests, and those would then collaborate with each other with the view of developing a solid global solutions. 5 more minutes? Is that too long?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. So I will make it short. I was asked also to talk about challenges that we have in the campaign for UN Parliamentary Assembly. The campaign was launched in 2007 based on support that existed previously in different quarters. The European Parliament already in 1994 adopted a resolution saying that a UN Parliamentary Assembly should be looked at. There's a broad base of support amongst individual parliamentarians across the world. And in some ways, I already mentioned some of the challenges that we are facing even in our day-to-day work. First is the individual outlook. We have supporters across the political spectrum, with the exception of the far right. And there is an easy explanation, because the reason why people support this idea of UN Parliamentary Assembly, World Parliament, has to do whether they identify with the nation-state system or whether they accept a world identity as well. So there are cosmopolitans across the political spectrum, and there are also people who, they are attached to a nation-state-based outlook, and we will find those in all parties. And the reason why we have no support in the far right, it's obvious, because the far right, per definition, is attached to nation-states, right? So that's one of the one of the challenges that we are dealing across the political spectrum with people who are still ingrained in nation-state thinking. One big problem is short-termism. What we are proposing is a long-term process of systemic change at the UN, that at some stage, if the political conditions are right, would move into the direction of the World Parliament. And however, admittedly, there are immediate problems that need to be addressed right now. And the problem is that short-termism means that people do not pay attention to the long-term systemic changes that are needed, but they are, dealing with things that are on the daily agenda. I'm really coming to an end. Another challenge is silo thinking. And that's very, very virulent in the UN. You got the whole silo, development agenda, peace, security, the SDGs, the 17 SDGs, that's all being dealt with in silos, right? And even climate change. What we are proposing is a systemic reform and transformation that has relevance across the board, everywhere, actually, in the long-term perspective. But we do not offer a short-term solution, like if the UN Parliamentary Assembly existed in a year, it's not a silver bullet to solve climate change, but it might be a way to overcome intergovernmentalism in the long run. So that's a big problem. Okay, I'm coming to an end. Thanks for your patience, really. There have been innovations in the international order normally only after big global calamities. First, the development of the idea of sovereignty in 1648 after the 30 Years' War, and then, of course, the development of the League of Nations after the First World War in 1919, the development of the UN in 1945 after the Second World War, the development of the International Criminal Court that came into force in 2002, actually as a consequence of the genocides in Darfur, in Bosnia, in Rwanda, and of course the Holocaust. And the question is, do we manage as human beings to, make a new successful leap forward without having, to go through a new calamity? And I hope this is going to happen. One last thing, Mathias, he once wrote, "The possibility of global democracy depends on our belief in the possibility of global democracy." And that's exactly right. We need to invest, a commitment into this. We need to believe in it, and only then it can become a reality. Thank you very much.
Well, from the passion with which Andreas has delivered his lecture confirms what I said at the beginning. There's material for a musical here, at least a movie. But we also now bring in, the perspective of a political scientist, Theresa Squatrito.
All right. Thank you very much. I should say, first of all, that the thinking was wonderful, and I appreciate the fine, delicate balance you're trying to have with optimism, with a little bit of pessimism, I would say. So I wouldn't say that you've taken this very overly idealistic kind of thought without considering problems and challenges and whatnot. So that's somewhat refreshing, right? Because I think a lot of the times idealism isn't also adequately consider challenges that are involved. I should also mention that my comments and reflections are very spontaneous. So forgive me if they're not well thought out. They are half-baked thoughts, let's just say, in my reflections. So I think in many ways it's quite interesting to think about, since coronavirus is the thing, that there's a lot of kind of points that you make that reflect on symptoms, causes, and treatments of this so-called world crisis, right? I very much agree that in terms of all of the sorts of things that you point to as symptoms, right? I have no problem in recognizing or in agreeing with you on the fact that there is a climate crisis, that we have refugee crises, that we have increasing inequality, a crisis of democracy at the nation state as we see a decline in democracy, as well as an increase of authoritarianism, right? Like, I agree on, I think on all of these points. my question for you and my thought is more along the lines of what are appropriate treatments, or not just appropriate, but what are the sorts of treatments that will work? So I think most of us agree and would know that taking antibiotics at this point isn't going to solve or treat you for coronavirus, right? So I think we need to ask that same question about the different sorts of symptoms that you observe. And the little bit of skepticism that is in me is actually driven by me thinking about how are national democracies dealing with some of these problems, and are they adequately resolving those? Because we don't have it at the global level yet. So, right, the best way I can try and observe this and think about it is from the domestic level. So in terms of the climate crisis, Greens in national democracy, or Green parties, still represent, I think, a fairly small portion of persons that are populations that exist in freely elected democracies, right? Democracies actually currently today are dealing with an extraordinary challenge of, I would say, right-wing populism, nationalist sentiments, xenophobia, those sorts of things. So if there are those issues around a refugee crisis or whatnot occurring at the domestic level inside of democracies, should we really think that democracy is going to be the solution for that problem? We might also see, again, the rising inequality. This is happening in democracies. Democracies are not immune to rising inequality. Same with the crisis of multilateralism. The country that I'm from, the US, is probably one of the biggest drivers of this crisis of multilateralism. And I still, despite some problems, would still count the US as a democracy, at least in terms of, in comparison to the other democracies that exist. I don't think it's that far off from others in many ways. So those are just some examples of at least questioning the extent to which democracy is the treatment that will make these problems go away. I don't have the direct answer to it, but I do think there's some reason to think we need to be a bit critical or have more assessment of that. The other thoughts that come to mind for me is basically a couple of points. One, I wonder if, you make the claim that getting to the point where we have a world parliament where there's one vote, one person, one vote, is an incremental process. Absolutely. I agree. We just look at the European Parliament, that's been the case, right? It's been incremental. So why can we not look at the existing global order, the existing global governance institutions, and give them also the benefit of thinking that they are on the process of working towards a freer, fairer set of global political processes. And for this, I would draw from some work that I'm quite familiar with that points to some very significant developments that have been occurring in recent decades in the sphere of global governance. The first is, which are incremental, right, in themselves. The first is there has been an expansion of international parliamentary institutions.
Absolutely.
There's a rise of them across the world in various regions. There's already one on a global level, right? The International Parliamentary Union. In addition, there's an expansion in the number of international courts, all of which have the ability to issue binding decisions. So to me, that suggests a move towards what you're demanding or envisioning. There's also an increase in the opportunities for non-state actors to access global governance institutions through a variety of different kinds of participatory forms of engagement, whether this be being able to, at the very least, observe global governance in action, or all the way to the end where there's opportunities to actually express a vote. So I would say those are also indications of incremental movement in this trajectory that you're hoping would come from specifically an a world parliament. The other is we see an increase in the number of binding international legal instruments, right? Many scholars have spoken of the legalization of world politics, which is most clearly observed through, if you just look at the mass amount of treaties that exist that bind states. Yes, some of them, indeed, many of them have problems of enforceability. But again, should we not give the benefit of the doubt that this is part of an overall incremental process in general? The other overall kind of question or thought I have for you relates to questions concerning the envisioned process of the World Parliament or envisioned World Parliaments that you are putting forward. And for this, I would just, and you recognize this primarily as a challenge, but I'm wondering if it's not just a challenge, but it ultimately becomes an impediment to what you're envisioning. And that is the fact that there are autocratic states, right? And what you're calling for as a starting point would include autocratic states. The reason I question that isn't for normative reasons that I think they shouldn't have a right to participate, but generally I know that the inclusion of, say, weaker democracies or states that don't have as much human rights protections can be socialized in environments and work us towards democratization. There's evidence that supports that. I agree with that. But here's the part that I'm wondering if in a world parliament it becomes a bit of a hiccup. Because if I understand you correctly, there would be state, to begin with, state appointment of delegates to this world parliament. And that the world parliament would also be based on transnational political groupings. In a lot of states in the world, there are not the freedoms to have political parties, right? So how do you get to the point where states don't domestically allow for freedom around people forming political parties to the point that they would actually at the global level have the ability to have a true sense of the variety of political ideologies that exist? It seems to me this could be a very large impediment if the idea is that it's these transnational political groupings that are going to be the basis by which ideas and decisions are made or coalitions are formed. So to me, I'm not sure how to make what to make of that. I obviously haven't thought through all the problems, and I'm sure you've thought about this a lot more than I. So I would appreciate any reflections you might have on that. So I guess two main points, right, and this little remaining one. Is that
okay?
fair?
Well, these are the challenges you're able to do when you say you have half-baked ideas. I'm scared what to think what you might do when you kind of have fully developed ideas. So these were great challenges. I think Andreas probably would like to take another 45 minutes to answer them, but I'll give you exactly 3. I'll give you exactly 3 minutes because I'm sure that people here in the room also have some important questions they want to ask. So exactly 3 minutes.
Well, okay, let's not waste time. Yes, there are autocratic states, and we need to look at the development of a world parliament as an incremental process, as you also rightfully pointed out. So it is, in fact, connected with the development of democracy at the nation-state level, and the powers that this body is supposed to get is connected with an increasing democratic legitimacy. So as long as the members of that assembly are not democratically legitimate, the body shouldn't have legislative powers. So it means that unless there is a democratic China, we are not proposing a world parliament that is making world law. Right. I think that what you said about the expansion of courts, the rise of international parliamentary institutions, and other such things, it actually confirms the fact that we are moving in this direction. But I think, in the direction of a cosmopolitan world order that is getting beyond the state of the nation state. However, what I perceive is a big, let's say, tension. There are different processes underway at the same time. Progressive processes, such as you pointed out, and I too. But at the same time, this very progress is threatened because we have not yet reached the level where it is sustainable. At any time, and I think the Trump presidency and others shows that those arrangements are at risk. The World Trade Organization, for instance, it's now no longer working. So
Portion of it.
yeah. Well, the appellate body, but right. So also the point I believe is important if we look at democracy at a domestic setting is that we are living in an interdependent world. So many issues that are being decided and discussed at the nation-state level, they are already outside the powers, regulatory powers of the established traditional nation-state institutions. And I think that's exactly what we are feeling as an impact on democracy. For instance, in terms of taxation, individual nation-states are no longer able to tax large corporations effectively, or high net worth individuals or others. So, and that's why I believe trust in those institutions is decreasing, because people, they might not be experts, but they feel that their institutions that they might have trusted before, they are no longer delivering what they are expecting them to deliver. How many minutes left? None, I guess.
Check.
Yeah.
20 seconds.
Wow. And just a remark on the Greens, or even more importantly, the political groups, perhaps. So even at the first stage, we would have a requirement that there are political groups. So the Communist Party of China would appoint a portion of the delegates. They would have to decide where they would integrate. That might not even be possible. But it is a way, even in the first stage, to tame the influence of autocratic pseudo-parliamentarians.
So there would be a communist.
Well, no. There would have to be the requirement, like in the European Parliament, that those groups would have to be representative of world regions and countries. So a minimum representation. The Communist Party of China, as far as I am concerned, wouldn't be able to form a group on its own. It would have to have, delegates they work with from the beginning. And of course, the question is whether such an arrangement is politically feasible. But that's a different matter at this stage.
Okay, good, excellent. So now it's time for democracy. It's your turn to express views, comments. I will take 3 questions at a time. I can see one hand over there. One over there, yes, and one over there. Okay, yes. This gentleman here. Yep.
So this picks up on one of the questions that you asked, which is, democracies at the domestic level have all these problems in their internal life. So why is that the solution at the global level? And your sort of response, as I understood it, was, well, one of the main reasons why they face these problems is that they're national democracies in this interconnected world. And maybe that's part of the story, but I think the general consensus, that's not the whole reason why you have problems like gridlock and declining trust. And, it's sort of systemic features like They're systems which are, by definition about a government and an opposition fighting it out, and there are winners and losers, and because you have to win to get anything done, therefore you become willing to cross ethical boundaries and so on. And so these are just kind of, you described sort of very elegantly the liberal democratic ideal, right? One person, one vote, separation of powers, and representation based on interest groups and so on. And then these are some of the problems associated with it at the domestic level, even if you imagine a single society. And so I guess my question is, when you're designing a global parliament, you have this opportunity to say, well, what should we do differently at the global level to avoid some of these problems? So what would make a global democracy, a global parliamentary assembly, avoid many of these problems that liberal democratic institutions face at the domestic level?
Okay, then over here.
Yeah, thanks for the lecture and for your work, which I very much admire. So in the beginning of your talk, you said that we're actually in a transitional period towards a world state. And I was asking myself, is that still true? Does that still capture the period in which we are living? Maybe it was true in the 90s and in the 2000s. But if I think about the world today, beyond coronavirus, what I see is kind of political regression, renationalization, and maybe even a backlash against that project of a world state or against political authority beyond the nation state. So, and if this is so, one might ask, is a world parliament maybe not part of the solution, but part of the problem? Because there might be a tension between what's normatively desirable and what's empirically possible. So if we would agree that a world parliament is normatively desirable, but if that would be a minority position, which actually leads to people entering the scene claiming, let's take back control. What are we doing?
Okay, and one last question here. And while the microphone goes in that direction, let me point out that this lecture, this meeting will be recorded and will become a podcast. Okay, so what you're going to say will be part of that podcast.
So actually the question is close to the previous one just now, but with the goal of, ultimate goal of a world parliament, I think it was mentioned even tonight that one of the key factors is to have or to develop a world identity, and this, the embryo of this, I think, was well stated at the Declaration of Intent of the European Union at the start, even so I don't think it was ratified, but I think it was a bit of the embryo of perhaps what needed going towards a world parliament. However, if we look at what has been happening exactly in the last 15 years or 20 years, to go in that direction, we need globalization, and globalization we seem to have at the economic level, but at the nation level or at the political national level, if you want, we seem rather to have gone the other way, as been shown by the examples such as the European Union and Brexit, for example, but also by various countries which decided that in terms of world identity, the best is to protect ourselves and to build our wall to protect from the neighbors. So I think perhaps you might want to comment on this aspect, which seems to go not at all in the right direction for the ultimate objective.
Okay, can you answer in 2 minutes? Is that possible?
I don't think that the issue and the development of the World Parliament is an opportunity to reinvent democracy from a fundamental perspective. I think that's something that has to grow bottom up. So there are instruments of participatory deliberative democracy that are being tested at the nation state level, like citizens' assemblies, referenda, whatever. And I think that is extremely useful. But I think we shouldn't do such experiments top down, right? We only have one chance, I think, to develop a sound global democratic system. And if we do it wrong, that would be bad. So I would argue it is true that we need to, reinvigorate and revive and strengthen, improve democracy in all sorts of ways. But at the global scale, we are at such an embryonic stage of democracy that even having an incomplete and imperfect body that represents the people would be a huge milestone forward. And while this is incrementally developing, I hope that we would have the experience from models tested elsewhere that then could be built into such a system. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it would be an incremental process that over time hopefully would benefit from tested models elsewhere. Yes, I mean, it's true. I mean, the transitional period towards a world state might have, left its peak, but what I'm referring to is the obvious need, from my point of view, that common global problems need management. And I would still argue that this management is extremely insufficient, right? So, and I mentioned at the very beginning the idea of a failed world state, right? So it's true, we are in, this setting where there is tensions between progress and regress in this world state, and we are in the phase of the failed state still of this world state, I would argue. And in terms of the World Parliament as part of the problem, is that I'm not sure I understood that exactly. Do you mean that it would provoke a counter reaction of people who are attached to nation state identity? Is that it? Right. I mean, this is true. That is a potentiality that we need to deal with. However, if we look at empirical studies in terms of whether people identify as world citizens and such, there are big majorities. From my perspective, the biggest stumbling block, it's not the ordinary citizens, but it's the national governments who don't want a system change of that kind, right? But we would have to look at it at a country-to-country basis. There are different results based on countries. There are opinion surveys on these things, actually. And in terms of Europe, I would argue the European project itself is also unfinished, from my perspective. That's a big problem, that the governments in the European Union didn't, take the last step of establishing a European federation, a sound European democratic system, but instead intergovernmentalism is still, at the core of the Union. And I think that's the problem behind many of the issues that we are dealing with in the EU. And I don't have much time, that's a limitation.
Okay, I saw some hands going up here. Yes, one. Okay, you want to wait for the microphone? Just one. Do not see someone else wanting to ask a question? You have a chance to raise your hand now. No? Okay.
Once again, it's just a thought that isn't same as half-baked. So, wouldn't having a world parliament become just an elitist system, because countries which are dealing with genocide and wars and stuff that are impacting the daily lives, the short term, as you said, wouldn't they be excluded from debate? They would exclude themselves from debates regarding taxation or climate change when they're dealing with genocide at home. So wouldn't that be just widens the gap between like elitist country, we call like developed country and developing countries?
Okay, anyone else would like to ask a question in this round? It might looked like that, I might actually ask a question myself. How wonderful. Okay, yes, you want to answer this question?
Yes. Well, first of all, from the normative perspective, what we propose is that all countries would be able to send delegates, including countries that are in a bad situation. But if we look, for instance, at Myanmar and the situation of Rohingya, they have no representation at the UN at all. So even if, because of the local settings, and Myanmar won't have a lot of delegates because there's an upper limit that we can allocate, like 700 to 900 for the body to still be effective. So small countries won't have a lot of delegates. However, the fact that we would have those transnational groups means that even if a certain ethnic minority in a country isn't directly represented, there would be others in the body that would, care for the situation there, right? They would, that's my imagination, they would interact with them, they would get their advice, they would speak on their behalf. And one proposal we also have is a part of the official system, how delegates are being elected or selected by national parliaments at the beginning and by direct elections later. Apart from that, at the committee and subcommittee level, we suggest to circumvent such problems that the political groups are able to co-opt non-voting members exactly from minorities that otherwise are not able to be there. So I think it's the very goal of that assembly to give a voice to people who otherwise are not being heard.
Okay, there's a question over there. If you want just to speak up, if you prefer.
Thank you, Manis. Yeah, the question is, this is a political science view. There are other sciences, social sciences, anthropology, maybe even going into some of the more biological sciences like zoology and so on, of the naked ape. And the question there is that this is an excellent view from a political science perspective, but I think the tensions really arise at other levels of understanding the interactions of humans as individuals and within groups, and the tensions that arise because of that. For instance, we're tribal and we're also a territorial species, as an example, from a more anthropological, zoological point of view.
Shall I respond to that?
Yeah,
Do you have
yeah.
a question also?
I have a question. Okay, there is another question. Let's take this question first, and then a question over there. Okay.
So just a quick question. So I mean, I'm a complete convert. I think it's a fantastic idea, this idea of a world parliament. And we have to try and make it happen. It's kind of going to save us from all these challenges that we're currently facing. But I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more, Andreas. I know that, I mean, what's really nice about your book is it gives a very kind of, it gives us a solution, a pathway for getting there. And what's great, I think, is that, as I understand it, the UN can be reformed relatively, I mean, in theory, relatively easily. And if you could tell us a bit more about how we get to a UN Parliamentary Assembly from where we are now, and what we could be doing here in the UK to kind of support that mission.
Okay, and then this gentleman over there. Yeah.
Thank you to propose these promising dreams for humanity. I'm a student from Taiwan. So Taiwan is a significant democracy and is suppressed by China. So what would be a solution in your plan for the case of Taiwan? That'll be my first question. And second one is, to my understanding, to build up a world state, pretty much like the question of how can we accommodate the national power and the supranational power. And here we have a very clear example right now is EU. So if we want to introduce a world state, why shouldn't we just open up the membership of EU to let the member states outside of Europe to participate in the UN integration process, to showing the world that this world state, this supranational state, it's workable, it's efficient, in the governance of the supranational problems like climate change, like coronavirus, and etc., then maybe the humanity, maybe the whole human society will have better confidence to achieve your dream and our dream.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Well, it is true that there are many dimensions that need to be considered here, and one stumbling block that I didn't mention, which is not necessarily from a political science perspective, is this dynamics of group formation and the formation of group identity by a distinction between us and them, you know, the other. And certainly that is relevant a lot from an anthropological point of view or a psychological point of view, because even the European Union integration project was to a large degree based on this confrontation between the East and the West, you know, after the Second World War still. So EU integration came for, you know, had a lot of power because there was a Soviet threat or perceived threat, whatever. And the thing is that humanity as a whole, you know, as a community, has no other. There is no aliens, right? If there was an alien threat, the world state would come about relatively quickly, you know. It would happen, you know, very quickly. And that's true. There are many such elements that are to be thought of here as well. And there are, you know, theoretical solutions towards that problem. So we would distinguish between us today and them in the past, right? So we build our identity distinguishing from those people in the past who, you know, who committed the Holocaust and who built nuclear weapons and who committed the climate, you know, apocalypse, and we are different people from them. But it's, you know, not yet working, I would say. Yeah, but I just reinforce what you're saying. It needs definitely to be studied, and I appreciate the question because I rushed through my presentation. I'm sorry. I pledged that I wouldn't talk too much about the crisis, and I did it again. And so, how do we get to UNPA from an international law perspective? It is easier to establish a consultative UN Parliamentary Assembly at the UN than to add just one seat in the Security Council, because changing the setup of the Security Council requires charter reform, and adding a consultative assembly to the General Assembly simply requires a decision of the General Assembly, which does not require charter reform, does not require an approval of the Security Council, does not require an approval of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So this is from you know, the legal instrument to do it is Article 22 of the UN Charter, which requires a majority vote of a General Assembly. So essentially what we need to do and what we try to do is mobilize that majority in the General Assembly. So far we have 0 governments. Yes, so, but they will come. So what you can do here in the UK, you can talk to our UK representative who's over there and just raising his hand. And the goal is specifically in the UK also to have a UK-based campaign that is lobbying the UK government to endorse this. And that's what we need to do in all countries, actually, that count. In autocracies, I don't know how far we can get there, but in the starting point, we don't need the approval of all. There are 115 electoral democracies in the world. That's a majority. That's you know, a group we can work with. Well, Taiwan is not a UN member state, and however, we can include Taiwan in a consultative UN Parliamentary Assembly with a system that delegates can be appointed by the political groups as non-voting members, right? So I believe that would be an improvement over today's system. It's not ideal, I would concede that, but Taiwanese representatives could be co-opted by political groups that are sympathetic to the Taiwanese cause, you know. And so I think that's part of the response to this. And of course, further down the road, as was indicated before, the whole idea rests on the belief that democracy sooner or later will succeed in China too. And then perhaps this whole problem will go away, right? So, and who knows? I mean, who was expecting the fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War even weeks before it happened? You know, so the geopolitical situation can change, you know, overnight actually, and in unexpected ways. Well, opening up the membership of the EU, I don't know. I mean, this is, in my very personal opinion, it's something one could think about. Why not? You know, why not? However, what I believe might be more realistic is this idea, you know, if we want to follow that scenario, is the idea of a community of democratic states that would perhaps be able to form the OECD, transformed NATO kind of thing. But I don't know whether that's really the solution we should put our, you know, which we should bet on, because if we deal with global challenges like climate change or others, we need, you know, almost universal participation of countries. And that's the tension also, right? Because, of course, we would like to work with democracies only, but that's not a possibility, because it's just our, you know, the world we live in, that's not yet the case. So having a body that discusses climate change without including mainland China makes no sense, right? So this is something where we have to have, you know, halfway solutions while we are, you know, incrementally moving forward. Yes, that was it, I think, in terms of questions. Yeah, your questions.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up. So you traced the intellectual genealogy to Anaxagoras clothes this figure in the French Revolution, and I think several of the kind of political scientists who contributed to the debate traced maybe their genealogy even further back to Machiavelli, who said that the politics needs to be studied as it is and not just as we would like it to be. So I'm pleased because I think this evening we obtained a good combination of clothes and Machiavelli, okay? A good combination of talking about ideals, but also about reality. So please join me all in thanking Andreas and Theresa.